All God's people said, amen and amen. Thank you, Dr. Logan, for bringing us into our meeting this afternoon. Welcome to, as it says, Perspectives on Liberty and Peace. This is our Sabbath afternoon presentation for our Religious Emphasis Sabbath, Religious Liberty Emphasis Sabbath. Thank you for being here. For those of you that are watching online, we welcome you as well. We trust that this afternoon will be a blessing to you. I know that many of you were able to be present this morning and have heard the introductions of our speaker, but I also know there are a handful that weren't, and there are more online that have not yet heard who our presenters are this afternoon. So let me go ahead and share here in alphabetical order. Bill Knott was our speaker here this morning. Bill Knott is an Associate Director of the Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Department of the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. He has worked at the church's world headquarters since 1997, serving for 25 years at the Adventist Review and Adventist World, the last 16 of those as senior editor. Before entering editorial work, Bill was a pastor for 18 years in congregations across 4 conferences in North America. His last pastoral appointment was as the senior pastor of the Walla Walla University Church. In his current role, he is the Seventh-day Adventist Church's representative to the United States government and coordinates the church's relationships with legislators, advocacy groups, and international embassies. With offices on Capitol Hill and at the church's world headquarters in Silver Spring, Maryland, he works to advise leaders on pending legislation, promote communication, and advance religious freedom. Bill, thank you for being here with us today. We appreciate it. Also this afternoon, we're very blessed to have with us Jennifer Gray Woods. Jennifer Gray Woods is currently legal counsel and director of public affairs and religious liberty at the Lake Union Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. She previously served for 7 years at the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists, first in the role of associate general counsel, where she focused on the areas of copyright, trademark, and data privacy, and later as associate pastoral director and director of government affairs. Before working for the denomination, she was an attorney for the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs in Washington, D.C., and a healthcare law firm in Los Angeles, California. Jennifer is a graduate of Oakwood College, where she earned her B.S. in biology, Johns Hopkins University, where she earned her master's in public health, and Harvard Law School, where she earned her doctorate of jurisprudence. She is a proud wife and mother of 2 young boys. Jennifer, thanks so much for being with us here this afternoon. The program will proceed unannounced. We are saving some time for Q&A at the end of our time together. The Q&A will be done via text. So if you left your phone in your car, you may need to run out and grab that. We will have a number on the screen to which you may text your questions. I will be receiving them and then sharing them with our august panel of contributors. Also want to introduce to you someone that I think is very familiar to you, Ron Knott. Ron Knott is one of our elders here. He and his wife Esther, they are co-head elders actually, Pioneer Memorial Church. Ron is also our Religious Liberty Director for Pioneer. Thank you, Ron, very much for all the effort you put into making this Sabbath a reality. We appreciate it. Ron is going to be sharing some presentations with us as well. Let me just share with you the order of events, and then I will sit down and we will begin. In just a moment, Jennifer will be sharing with us on religious liberty and why it still matters in 2025. Following that, Ron Knott will be sharing part 1 of Persecution on the Twos, 1492, 1572, and 1662, part 1 in that. Bill Knott will then be sharing after that a kite, a string, and a bridge. You'll have to be here. Ron will then share with us again his vignette, part 2 of Persecution on the Twos, 1492, 1572, and 1662. I will then share with you a few minutes on political philosophy and the implications of Revelation 13, and then we will open the floor for Q&A. Thank you for being here with us, and without further ado, Jennifer, please come and share with us.
Shane, and happy Sabbath, everyone. It's so nice to be worshiping with you all, and especially to see some familiar faces from elementary school, Mrs. Whitting, and also from the academy, with Mr. White. So I'm going to be speaking this afternoon on religious liberty and why it still matters. And I want to start with a definition of religious liberty. I'm going to define religious liberty as the right to practice and believe in a religion or in no religion at all without government interference. And as Adventists, we've been strong advocates of religious liberty. Adventists we've seen this religious liberty as a theme in the Great Controversy. We know that freedom of choice is an expression of God's character of love, and that Satan has been making the claim since the beginning that God forces our love. We know that throughout the story of redemption and this cosmic battle, we've seen God's love put to the test. And we've also seen the true nature of Satan's accusations. The creation story reveals a loving God who created humans with free will to accept or reject God's leadership over our lives. And because God created humans in his own image with this ability to choose to reject him, he also gives us the ability to love him freely as well. And unfortunately, we've used our freedom of conscience to choose separation and death. But God didn't leave us there in that state without hope. The gospel shows religious liberty in that God sent his son to come and save us if we choose to accept that gift of salvation. Jesus said, "If the Son sets you free, you shall be free indeed." And Jesus came to free us from the enslaving power of sin and the consequences that we're supposed to experience, right? This death and separation from him. It's because of this freedom purchased by Jesus, our Savior, at such a great cost, the cost of his own life, that we, as his followers, value it, this gift of freedom, so much. But God did not even force us to accept the salvation that he offered us. We have the right to reject salvation, and many, in fact, have rejected this gift. But we as Adventists, we value the right of people to choose to accept or reject the gift of salvation, not because we're fearful or worried about, fearing God and his wrath, but because we cherish the sacrifice that Christ made for us on the cross. Because we value the freedom that God offers us, we champion the protection of the free exercise of religion for people of all faiths and for people of no faith at all. And it's also a reason that we are against any attempt at the coercion of the conscience. For this reason, from the inception of our church, Seventh-day Adventist Christians have been dedicated to an individual's free choice in matters of faith and religion. We believe that all people are created in the image of God and worthy of dignity, compassion, and respect. For more than 170 years, the Seventh-day Adventist Church has promoted freedom of belief for all people. And we can look back in 1901 when the Adventist Church established the first Department of Religious Liberty. And a few years later, in 1906, when they began publishing Liberty Magazine, a magazine on religious freedom that you heard about earlier today. Our church has infused the public affairs and religious ministry throughout every level of our church structure, from the local church through the conference, the union, the division, all the way up to the general conference. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the work that I do and that some of my co-laborers in the Pastoral Department do as well. So the mission of the Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Ministry is this: to proclaim and defend the God-given gift of religious freedom, which is integral to our identity as Seventh-day Adventist Christians. As you can see from our name, the department is twofold. We have the public affairs work and the religious liberty work. A central component to our ministry is public affairs. The public affairs work focuses on spreading the identity, message, and mission of the church by mingling with people and sharing the distinct Adventist message. Through building key relationships in the community, the Pastoral Department seeks to position our church to a standing of credibility, trust, and relevance in the public space. We build relationships with those who may impact our freedom. This might include civic leaders, religious groups, or others within the community with influence. And we introduce ourselves in the community as Seventh-day Adventist Christians, demonstrating God's love as a source of hope. We're also engaged in the work of promoting and protecting religious liberty, and we do this in a number of ways. We do this through monitoring legislation and cases that could impact religious liberty rights. We monitor federal and state legislation and administration policies that potentially impact the religious freedom of the church or its members. We also engage in advocacy work. The North American Division partners with the General Conference to advocate on Capitol Hill on behalf of the religious interests of Seventh-day Adventist Church and its members, and also on behalf of others when it deals with religious freedom rights. At the North American Division, they work together with the General Conference to meet with congressional officials, and they partner with fellow religious freedom organizations in coalition efforts, submitting letters of support or concern to federal agencies and submitting written testimony to congressional committees. Here at the Union, we're engaged and will be more engaged, in fact, in state-level religious freedom advocacy by meeting with our state representatives and local officials as well. This is an initiative that we're working on together with our conference parole directors to make sure that we're also doing this advocacy work at a local level that's going on in Washington, D.C. Our church also protects religious liberty rights through litigation and assisting members when they're having religious accommodation issues, such as workplace accommodation issues, which we deal with a lot here at the Union level. Seventh-day Adventists have a long history of defending religious freedom through the courts. Today, our church continues to be involved in litigation defending religious freedom, not just for our church members, but for believers from many other faiths as well. In fact, some pivotal First Amendment constitutional cases have had Seventh-day Adventist church members as plaintiffs. Perhaps you're familiar with the case of Sherbert v. Verner. It's a 1963 case, so some of you may or may not be familiar with it. But in this case, there was a church member who was denied unemployment benefits after she was fired because she refused to work on the Sabbath. And this case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the court eventually held that denying these benefits to Ms. Sherbert was infringing on her right to the free expression of religion. And this became precedent for future Supreme Court cases, protecting many other people when they needed Sabbath accommodation issues or other religious accommodation issues as well. In the United States, the religious freedom challenge, again, that we most often see, that our members face at least, are the religious rights of employees in secular workspaces. Title VII and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, they have guidelines that prohibit employers from discriminating against individuals because of their religion in hiring, firing, or other terms and conditions of employment. And at the union level, I've helped numerous members with accommodation issues, helping them with writing letters maybe to their employer, helping them with filing with the EEOC, helping with mediation. And when those efforts don't come to a conclusion that helps the member, then I work with the North American Division Litigation Committee, and they may take on cases to help members by providing them with outside counsel in further steps with the district courts. But our church is involved with more than just Sabbath accommodation issues. We've helped defend literature evangelists, prisoner cases, and religious land use issue cases. And our church has also filed friend of the court briefs or amicus briefs in support of key religious principles that come before the U.S. Supreme Court. So as I stated earlier, part of our work is to monitor legislation and cases that could potentially impact religious liberty rights. And I'm going to talk about some of the issues that I've been keeping an eye on recently in the last couple of months. Now, I've organized these issues into two groups. And this isn't the only way to organize these issues. There are many other ways they could be placed into buckets, but it's a way that makes sense to me. So I'm going to talk about the issues today in two main buckets. The first one dealing with the Establishment Clause, and the second one dealing with the Free Exercise Clause. And both of these clauses are part of the First Amendment, which says that Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And as I look at the religious liberty issues, I see erosions of both of these principles in legislation that's been passed or proposed, and also in cases that are now before the court, both at the district level, the Court of Appeals, and one that's all the way up to the Supreme Court at this time. So the first issue I'm going to talk about is the issue of public schools and public education. We know that public schools in America have been a religious freedom battleground for decades. And in recent years, we've seen a number of states promoting state-sponsored religion within the education system. 3 states in particular have been in the news a lot in recent months as far as some of their legislative efforts that are trying to infuse Christianity into the public school setting. So first, I'm going to talk about Texas. So in May of 2023, the Texas legislature passed Senate Bill 763, which allows school districts to hire chaplains as counselors within the public school system. This means that counselors that a student who maybe is an atheist might be getting, it might be a religious chaplain that's giving counsel to this student. Now, to date, most of the school districts have rejected placing chaplains within the school system, but it's still a law that's out there that has not been challenged as yet. Another thing that Texas is currently doing is the Board of Education recently approved a Bible-based curriculum for grades K through 5. And again, this is within the public school system, right? A biblically based curriculum. And it infuses the Bible into various subjects. So while it isn't a requirement for school districts to use this Bible-based curriculum, there's a financial incentive that's been put in place to incentivize school districts to do so. They get additional funding if they use the Bible-based curriculum. Another thing that Texas is currently doing is they're trying to follow the footsteps of Louisiana, which is what the state I'll talk about next, by proposing legislation to require the 10 Commandments to be posted in the schools. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Louisiana and some of the initiatives that they've been engaged in, but it has been in the news recently as far as the 10 Commandments being required in every classroom. And this happened last year. Louisiana passed a law requiring state public school classrooms to display the 10 Commandments. And these displays have to be posted in every classroom all year round, regardless of what subject is being taught and regardless of the age of the student. Now, a year before this legislation was passed, Louisiana passed another requirement, requiring the phrase, "In God we trust," to be placed in every classroom. And they told instructors that they have to teach students about this phrase as a patriotic custom, a move that has been criticized by some as a form of religious coercion. Now, going back to the 10 Commandments requirement, challenges were made by parents and others concerning this requirement, and a district court judge has recently ruled that HB 71, that's the law that requires the 10 Commandments to be placed in each classroom, that it violates the First Amendment and long-standing Supreme Court precedent. More than 40 years ago, there was a case called Stone v. Graham. It was a case in Kentucky where the court struck down a similar law requiring the 10 Commandments to be placed in the classroom. And this district court judge found that, first off, Stone is still good law. So if you're following precedent, then this law should not be able to stand. But even putting Stone aside, the district court judge found that the plaintiffs had alleged that this law fails to comply with the Establishment Clause analysis. They recognized that it would lead to religious coercion by the state because children are literally required to sit in these classrooms all day, right? They have attendance requirements. They're required to sit in this classroom and look at these 10 Commandments, and they're being taught things that they might not agree with at home. The judge said that each of the plaintiff's minor children will be forced in a practical sense to be a captive audience, and regardless of the age of the student or the subject matter of the course, and that this requirement is coercive and inconsistent with the history of the First Amendment and public education. The court also said that HB 71 would violate the free exercise clause of the parents of these students. Now, the interesting thing is, even though the district court judge has put an injunction on this, it's still at the level of the Court of Appeals at this point. So we don't know how this case is going to turn out. And it could be that this case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and we'll just have to continue monitoring to see where this goes. The last state I want to talk about is Oklahoma. So I don't know if you remember Oklahoma, but a couple of years ago, this is the state that tried to fund a religious charter school with public funding. It was going to be a public religious charter school paid with taxpayer dollars. That fell through, but that did not stop Oklahoma, because the school superintendent has now required all public school districts in Oklahoma to keep a copy of the Bible in every classroom as a historical reference and to incorporate Christian text into their lesson plans, especially in history courses. There was a mandate that was sent out, and this letter said, effective immediately, all Oklahoma schools are required to incorporate the Bible, which includes the Ten Commandments, just to be clear, as an instructional support into the curriculum across specified grade levels, grades 5 through 12. And he goes on to say that this is not merely an educational directive, but a crucial step in ensuring that our students grasp the core values and historical context of our country. Now, these are just some examples where I think that the ideology of Christian nationalism is at play. This is a transparent effort at promoting Christian values and Christian symbols into the school system, either through encouraging a Bible-based curriculum in a public school setting, or by posting the Ten Commandments within every classroom, or by requiring every state to have a Bible and to promote the Bible and teach the Bible in various courses. And Christian nationalism is this mixing of our national identity with a Christian identity, and it's trying to establish a Christian nation, saying that we need to go back to our roots as a Christian nation. What it really says is that to be a good American citizen, you also have to be a good Christian. As if individuals of other faiths or no faith at all really aren't as American as Christians are. And this mixing of our national identity with a Christian identity, or with any other religious identity for that matter, should concern us, because we know that the state endorsement of religion can quickly turn into state coercion of religion, which can quickly turn into state persecution of those that do not align with whatever the majority is advocating for. So switching now from the Establishment Clause issues, I want to talk about some cases that have dealt with the Free Exercise Clause. And there's some cases here where I think that the Free Exercise Clause may have been infringed upon or violated. So the first case I want to talk about is one that's taking place in Maryland. Actually, it's taking place in Montgomery County, the county where the General Conference is actually headquartered. And in this case, there's a group of parents who are suing the Montgomery County Public School Board. The case is called Mahood v. McKnight. It's also referred to as Mahood v. Taylor, and it deals with a 2022 law where the Montgomery County Public Schools added storybooks that are featuring LGBTQ characters in its elementary school curriculum. The board announced over 20 books for these inclusivity books for its pre-K through 8th grade classrooms. And some of these books talk about gender transitioning, how to use pronouns. They talk about what it means to be non-binary. And in fact, some of the books talk about this concept that doctors are only guessing when they identify a newborn baby's sex. Okay? And these are books that are being taught to very young children. The curriculum is also concerning because it suppresses free speech, because teachers are told to tell students that if they question these controversial ideologies, that they're being hurtful. So don't question it. This is just what is. So when the board first went public with its Pride storybooks, it assured parents that they would be notified when these books were being discussed, and that parents would have the right to opt out if they didn't want their children being part of these discussions. In fact, Maryland is like most states where parents have the right to opt out when it comes to issues of sexuality or sex ed discussions. This is common practice. And initially, the county respected these opt-out requests that the parents made. But by March of 2023, these requests had come from so many parents that it was becoming unmanageable, according to the county, to honor these requests. And the county decided instead that the opt-outs would no longer be permitted in the new school year. Parents from a variety of faiths had issue with this because they believed that they should have the right to guarantee that their children aren't being taught things, especially things dealing with sexuality, that are against their religious beliefs. And these parents sued, and they're asking to be notified when these books are being used. Well, in May 15th of this last year, the Fourth Circuit found that the parents with children enrolled in the Montgomery County School don't have the right to be notified when these books are being used. That this pushing of the ideology of gender identity and human sexuality was within the realm of the school, and that parents just had to be okay with that. This case is now pending before the Supreme Court. We don't know at this time if the court's going to take this case or not. The court hasn't decided every case that it's going to take for this term, and it's just a case that we're watching. We've also seen a number of pronoun cases that have come up over recent months. And one example is a case in Wisconsin. It's the case of Cernick v. the Argyle School District, where Mr. Cernick is a history teacher, and the school had a policy that teachers have to use the preferred pronouns of their students. Well, Mr. Cernick, for religious reasons, said that he could not comply with this policy. And at first, the school board was okay. They said, fine. He had a practice of, instead of calling anyone by their pronouns, he would just point to students. That was fine. He also said, I'll call them by their last name, as to not single anyone out. Well, this was going along well, but then 2 months later, the school board reversed its course with this accommodation and said, you have to comply with the policy. You're no longer getting an accommodation. Mr. Cernick refused, and his contract was not renewed, which for teachers is basically the same as being terminated. It's the same as being fired. So this case is now before the court, and we've seen this not just in Wisconsin, but in a number of states. In some states, such as Virginia, the courts have sided, actually in most of the states, courts have sided with the plaintiff, with the teacher, saying that it is a violation of their free exercise to force them, to compel them to speech that they don't agree with for religious reasons. But this hasn't stopped numerous states from implementing these kinds of policies, and we don't know yet how this particular matter is going to play out in the end. I had some other cases to talk about, but I'm just going to skip to one last case, and it's also taking place in Wisconsin. And this is the case of Catholic Charities versus Wisconsin, the Department of Labor, Industry, and Review, that commission. And the reason I want to talk about this case, because it is the only case so far that is a religious liberty case that the Supreme Court has decided to hear this term. So it's important to kind of pay attention to it. And Catholic Charities is a charitable organization that's affiliated with the Catholic Church. It provides services to the poor, the disabled, and the elderly. Its mission is to carry out the redeeming work of the Lord by reflecting gospel values and moral teachings of the church. And it carries out this mission by providing services to the poor and disadvantaged. Well, Catholic Charities doesn't actually only hire Catholics in providing this mission. First off, it serves anyone of any faith, and it hires individuals who are of other faiths as well. And because of this, and also because of the services it's providing, Wisconsin has said that these aren't actually religious services, that these are secular charitable services. And so there's certain exemptions that the Catholic Charities has asked for, and the state has said, no, you're providing food for the poor and clothing and shelter, those aren't religious in nature. I think as Adventists, we would disagree with that understanding by the Wisconsin Supreme Court, and we're going to see how the U.S. Supreme Court handles this matter. Do they see these services as secular in nature? Do they see these services as religious in nature? Are they going to say that, hey, we're not going to delve into a religious organization's understanding of what constitutes secular and religious, because that's then the state delving into matters of faith. I'm more than happy to talk about some of these cases during the Q&A, and I hope that you all stay vigilant and looking at what's going on, not just here in Michigan, but also around the nation, because these matters of religious liberty, they impact us all, even if not right now, in the future. And this is why our church is so focused on monitoring these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Attorney Woods. I have a little hobby of noting interesting or sometimes ironic connections or coincidences among historic events. Very local example, Sutherland House. The building I get to go to work to every day on this campus was the very first building built on this campus. It was built in the spring of 1902, and by the early 1980s, it was a wreck. And the administration had decided to tear it down. But a persistent trustee insisted that it be saved and restored because it was our last architectural link with the pioneers who brought the institution here. So came the day when there was a big dedication ceremony with the officers of the General Conference all here and the university trustees all gathered in a big festive occasion on the front lawn of Sutherland House to celebrate the fact that Sutherland House had not been torn down, but rather restored to honored use. That was on June 12, 1987, the very same day that an even more illustrious crowd was gathered in Berlin, then West Germany, to hear Ronald Reagan exclaim, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Anybody that gets a tour of Sutherland House gets that little speech. Some of you of a certain age or a certain hair color similar to mine, whether you allow it or not, or born perhaps in the late 1950s or earlier, will know exactly where you were on November 22, a Friday, 1963. You will know that that was the day that President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. But if you're also well familiar with the famous 20th century Christian apologist C.S. Lewis, you also may know, or you didn't know, that he died on the very same day. And on February 12, 1809, Charles Darwin and Abraham Lincoln were born on the very same day. Two people, giants of the 19th century, for good or ill, born on the very same day. In this and in my second little vignette, and these are short little vignettes between the much more illustrious ones that are presented here, I will be presenting a couple of interesting connections among events that have something to do with religious liberty, or more particularly with religious persecution. Singling these out in no way gives them special place above others, nor diminishes the importance of other events, often much more momentous or even monstrous than in the past or even taking place in our own day. But I'm using the simple little organizing principle here of a few things that we ought to know something about from the past, and they all have something to do with years ending with 2. 1492, 1572, 1662, and so I call this persecution on the twos. It's tough for us non-historians to get our minds around the history of the persecution of the Jews. Most Western countries have their own dark legacy. And for our purposes, for a few moments, we're just focusing on territories in the 15th century of what we now call Spain. The 15th century was particularly complicated in Spain regarding the Jews with times of government or church-sponsored violence against them in the burning of synagogues and the destruction of property, in a few cases outright massacre. And there were other times during that century of uneasy toleration and others of extreme pressure for forced conversions to Christianity. And it's important to understand in this case it was mostly religious persecution, not so much racial persecution as it may have become in later centuries and as we well know from the 20th and even the 21st. However, through all of this, near the end of the 1400s, Isabella, Queen of Castile, married Ferdinand II, King of Aragon, and they dynastically unified what we now call of as Spain. The big emphasis during those persecutions was forced conversions, or else. And early in 1492, they began working on a decree that all Jews who did not convert to Catholicism must leave the country or else. That decree in 1492 was announced on March 31. And they set a date of July 31st for the final expulsion, which, due to complex shipping arrangements at the ports to embark potentially thousands of people, effectively worked out to August 2, 1492. Historians have collected contemporaneous accounts of the horror of the remaining Jews in Spain who chose not to convert, having on very short notice to sell all of their possessions, often at a fraction of its worth, to grasping, mean-spirited opportunists, just to pay the fare to get on the ships, practically, in a sense, having to dig their own grave. They had to pay their own fare in order to be expelled, and let alone having anything left to start a new life somewhere else. How many people did this involve? Historians estimate that at the time of the decree, there were about 100,000 Jews in Spain who had not yet converted under forced conversions previously throughout the century. And by the time that the deadline was approaching, about 60,000 of them did effectively convert. At that time and under that pressure, 60,000 of them probably did convert under that, leaving about 40,000 Jews to be expelled and thus completely exterminating the practice of Judaism in Spain. Now, most of us know about Ferdinand and Isabella, not for this, but for only one thing: sponsoring Christopher Columbus's first expedition to find a sea route to the Indies. So, in early 1492, while they were working on the expulsion decree under pressure from the church, they were also negotiating with Columbus for his great adventure. And the date for the start of his expedition was set: August 2, 1492. The renowned historian Daniel Borston, former Librarian of Congress, puts it this way: thousands whose only crime was their faith in their God, were on that very day being crammed into the holds of ships. Out of the Gulf of Cadiz, they would be shipped to a well-known, unfriendly old Christian world. Some would seek refuge in the Netherlands, others in the more tolerant world, get this, in the more tolerant world of Islam. In the early morning of August 3, the very same tide that carried the hapless Jews to an old world of persecutions carried Columbus's 3 vessels toward their unwitting discovery of a new refuge for the persecuted. A new refuge for the persecuted. August 3, 1492. On the one hand, thousands expelled out of Spain in religious persecution. On the other, an expedition out of Spain to found a new world that would become a bastion of religious toleration.
This morning I had the opportunity to talk about how believers face the powers that be, the world of truly public affairs. But I have another burden on my heart about the publics within. The conversations and the communication that happen or don't between believers. You heard me say this morning that so much of the book of Acts is centered on the experience of conflict, mostly conflict between believers and external authorities, but occasionally conflict between believers themselves. I want to take a few moments to talk about how we address among us our relationships and the conflicts that arise within. I have been living with this story since a cold January day almost a half century ago. I was caught by it in my fourth grade classroom. Back then, it was a story about the cleverness of a child just slightly older than I was. Later on, it became a story about cool-headed tactical planning. Maybe that was the quality that I needed as a young adult or a middle-aged adult. So the story spoke to me that way then. Unbridgeable chasms yawned at every turn, and my days were filled with professional and even personal disruptions. More recently, this same story has become for me a potent metaphor about how we bridge the great divides that naturally grow up between individuals, in groups, yes, in congregations, and even between large Christian organizations. This is the other kind of public affairs, the publics within. I suspect that I am not done with this story yet, that in the words of the poet Robert Frost, I shall be telling this with a sigh somewhere ages and ages hence. Maybe another life moment will show me a facet in this story that I have been missing. And that's probably a good thing. For good stories, great stories, are never fully understood. By the fall of 1847, 3 decades of thawing relations between the United States and Canada had largely erased the memories of their last shooting war. That war had erupted over the boundary Niagara River during the War of 1812. But that was 35 years before. There was now a booming economy on the US side, and there was enormous potential, economic potential on the Canadian side. Governments and business leaders on both sides wanted greater ties between the two nations. A bridge was needed to span the turbulent river that marked the boundary between the British Empire and the United States, the nation that had just won its freedom from Great Britain and declared independence 70 years before. An engineering firm was hired to design the first suspension bridge over what was deemed to be an unbridgeable and treacherous chasm, the Whirlpool Rapids, located just above the famous Niagara Falls. The chasm was 800 feet across and 225 feet above the water level. That was the narrowest point between the two sides. Depending on which version of the story you prefer, the supervisor of the architectural firm, the engineering firm, Theodore Hewlett, either personally solved the architectural puzzle or, in the version that I believe and for which there is more historical evidence, in that version, he got the inspiration, the brainstorm for a bridge by watching boys fly kites out over the Whirlpool Rapids. Hewlett organized a kite flying contest for January 1848. coldest month of the winter, with the goal of landing a kite and its string on the other side of the chasm. Dozens of Canadian and American boys responded to the challenge. The prize he offered, $5, would today be worth more than $150 in both Canadian and US currencies. One talented kite flyer, 16-year-old Homan Walsh, crossed the river to the Canadian side well above the falls and the rapids, and he successfully landed his kite on the American side early in the contest, but at the critical moment, the string broke. The teenager ended up being marooned on the Canadian side of the river by bad weather for a full week. He finally retrieved his kite and tried again 2 weeks later. This time, he let out hundreds of feet of string as the prevailing westerly Canadian winds carried his kite, which he had symbolically named Union, carried his kite out over the swirling rapids. He flew it all afternoon. Toward nightfall, as the winds began to die down, Union settled in a tree on the US side. And the string was secured by Hewlett's workmen. Now, a single string, a kite string, united the two nations. And over that string, Hewlett's engineers drew a slightly heavier string riding on a silver ring. And over that slightly heavier string, an even heavier string riding on the silver ring. And over that heavier string, the first rope, and over that rope, the first thin metal wire, until strand by strand, one small step at a time, incrementally but irresistibly, the foundation for the first suspension bridge over the Niagara River was built, and it all rested on, yes, a kite string. This isn't the usual plot line about how big divides get crossed. As we typically tell such stories, some great heroic gesture has to happen to bridge the unbridgeable. I mean, Richard Nixon had to go to China. Anwar Sadat had to go to Jerusalem. Joe Biden had to go to Hanoi. That was hard. Presidents and prime ministers, they stand before the cameras in some distant territory and they clasp hands to signal the ending of some version of a Cold War. What could be accomplished by something as insubstantial, something as fragile as a kite string? But behind the grand heroic gestures that capture our imaginations and the headlines, there are 100 smaller moments on which all reconciliations ultimately depend. Someone picks up the phone, even the red phone, and calls a person long thought of as an enemy. Two diplomats from warring sides go for an unobserved walk in a snowy Vienna forest, and the history of the 20th century was changed. A private note is passed from hand to hand around a tense negotiating table and signals a new possible solution to an old and endless quarrel. Let it be said, there's a string, a kite string, beneath all hopeful moments when our broken, proud humanity tries to make peace with other broken, proud human beings. Someone swallows hard. Someone deliberately puts aside the memory of the latest injury. Someone sends out an olive branch, or maybe just an olive twig, to an opponent on the other side of the boardroom or the other side of the church business meeting. Someone prays for weeks about the Apostle Paul's admonition, forgive each other just as the Lord has forgiven you. and they hesitatingly walk down the hall, and they pick up a basin and a towel. Leaders, even church leaders, sometimes manage to put aside the clamoring of partisans and the assertions of correctness, and they send a text that says simply, let's talk. Let's talk. All reconciliations ultimately depend on things as fragile as kite strings. Now, some of you will be tempted in the moments that follow to assign to my remarks some situation that you know, perhaps even some situation in your community. You will be tempted to assume that I am supporting one perspective or providing ammunition to some combatant you care about. Well, in the words of a good old Adventist hymn, yield not to temptation. I'm speaking and speaking deliberately to issues on the level of biblical principle. You have to take responsibility, I hope you do, for any applications you make of those principles. More than 15 years ago, and several shooting wars ago, I began an editorial in the Adventist Review with these lines. If I had an extra $1 million and the inclination to give it away, I'd probably create the Homan Walsh Possibilities Award and annually bestow it, a healthy chunk of it, that money, on some Adventist who goes about the difficult business of bridging the divides among us. Well, it's a sadness today to tell you that I have yet to give away the first Homan Walsh Possibilities Award. And not because I don't have the extra $1 million, I still don't, but sad because there seem to be so few candidates deserving of the prize. You don't need me to tell you that we live in fractious times. The toxic, intensely partisan political culture in all nations of the world now, but especially in the United States. It's seeped into the company of those who say they keep the commandments of God and have the faith of Jesus. From behind the barricades of blogs and lava-infused newsletters, we launch fusillades against the decisions and the integrities of those who disagree with us. They aren't simply those who disagree. No, they are wrong. No, really, actually, they are wrong. No one so foolish, so spineless, so careless, so thoughtless has ever previously walked the earth as the person we want to demonize. We hide behind pseudonyms and website addresses that publicly position us as positive affirmers of whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, and you can't find much of that there. But we tear into each other. We tear into each other with all the ferocity of carnivores. That's a special irony in a religious movement such as our own, where the fiercest battles are frequently between vegans and vegetarians. Red meat, hot, reckless rhetoric designed to win us friends and destroy some enemies. Red meat is the special of the day in those fights. Any conflict, from the classic congregational battles about the color of the sanctuary carpet, to the intense and prolonged controversy about whether the church ought to ordain qualified women to gospel ministry, any conflict has fuel enough in it to warm its advocates and to still scorch those that are deemed enemies of the cause. In his prophecy of the turmoil that would precede his second coming, Jesus unflinchingly described the end times as an era where the love of many will grow cold. You've heard the phrase. It follows just as logically then that the hatred of many, even for other believers, will grow hot as well. And you have examples. Like the dragon who inspires such enmity, they sense that their time is short. We pray that it is. So am I overdrawing the story? Do you know this story too? Is there still a way to bridge what seems unbridgeable? Is there still a moment when we could imagine, even fleetingly, a kite string landing on the other side? Are there still thousands, millions of honest-hearted Seventh-day Adventists who have listened to the appeal of Paul? Here's Paul writing, "From now on, therefore, we regard no one from a human point of view, even though we once knew Christ from a human point of view. We know him no longer in that way. So if anyone is in Christ, there is a new creation. Everything old has passed away. Everything has become new. All this is from God, who has reconciled us to himself through Christ and has given us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and entrusting the message of reconciliation to us." I believe that there are, in fact, a nearly uncountable number of faithful members of this pilgrim movement who still yearn for reconciliation, even with those who've injured them. Some of them, no doubt, have heard of a song that Ron and I grew up with on an old LP recording. It was a song that used to drift among the campfires of soldiers during the American Civil War, at just the time this denomination was organized in the 1860s. Here are the words. "We're tenting tonight on the old campground. Give us a song to cheer our weary hearts, a song of home and friends we love so dear. Many are the hearts that are weary tonight, waiting for the war to cease. Many are the hearts that are looking to the right to see the dawn of peace. We're tired of war on the old campground. Many are dead and gone. Of the brave and true who've left their homes, others have been wounded long. Many are the hearts that are weary tonight, wishing for the war to cease. Many are the hearts that are looking to the right to see the dawn of peace." The future of this movement doesn't chiefly depend on leaders in conference offices or division offices who we hope will agree to talk and mend fences and resume their trust in those with whom they disagree. Let's be clear, they have a helpful role to play, but they can only lead where others choose to follow. The decisive feature of the Adventist future isn't going to be determined chiefly at some general conference session which finally decides on some elegant structure to bridge our unbridgeable chasms. The future of this movement, I genuinely believe, is going to be built on 100,000 small, fragile kite strings, landed gracefully in places that haven't seen many kites or much grace in a long time. It will be built by reconciliations across the kitchen table between spouses. It will emerge across board meetings among elders. You might even see a change when sharp-tongued Sabbath school combatants finally agree at last that he is our peace. In his flesh, he made both groups into one and has broken down the dividing wall, that is, the hostility between us. Here's how it might happen. 1, pray for a reconciling spirit. All great things begin with prayer, and the greatest of these is love. This means frequently I have to pray against the grain, against the natural tendency of my heart to assume my own correctness, especially in matters that I deem truth. We're all aware that we occasionally get some at least minor fact wrong, but we are much less willing to admit that we could be in error on some long-held point of view, like the imperative of a plant-based diet, or the ultimate authority of the Holy Spirit in determining who receives gifts in the remnant church. And we're never going to move an inch, never mind ascend the hill of the Lord, unless we begin praying with a sincerity that has not yet been known among us for an attitude of reconciliation with those whom we are sure are wrong. This kind of interchange doesn't spontaneously appear in a moment when the church business meeting sings side by side, or as I mentioned this morning, somewhat scornfully, we hold hands and sing Kumbaya. The emotions of any given moment are going to disappear just as quickly as they came unless there's a consistent, persistent commitment to pray for reconciliation, first in our own hearts and then in the hearts of those with whom we disagree. Pray without ceasing and pray for reconciliation. Point one. Point two, be alert for olive branches and kite strings. The smallest, slenderest strands became the base of a bridge that within 18 months was carrying locomotives across the Niagara River. An olive branch, it may first appear as insubstantial as a twig. It may look like just another combustible that you can throw on the flame of your deep anger. But those to whom grace has given a reconciling spirit can see signs of life and hope where others only see fuel. In the early years of our marriage, when Debbie and I were living in a basement apartment 5 miles off campus with deep red shag carpet on the walls as well as the floor, she and I learned soon enough to develop a signal when we wanted to end an argument that had arisen, one of those consequential ones about whether the toilet seat had been returned to level, or in which order the silverware went in the drawer. Our little signal was this. One or the other of us would say something with seeming gruffness, like, "I love you, you old fool." To which the other one would add, in the same tone, "I love you too, you old fool." We learned, as all long-married couples eventually do, to see the small and hopeful signs that the conflict didn't need to go on forever. We learned that we could soon enough be laughing at the foolishness from which our quarrels sprang, and we have been laughing for just over 43 years now. In boardrooms, this may be as momentary as a sigh. It may be the opening of the chairman's hands to signal that his mind has opened too. It may be a brief acknowledgement that there's at least a little legitimacy in the other person's way of seeing. In executive committee meetings, this may mean congratulating a philosophical opponent on the clarity and thoughtfulness of what she has just presented. So practice spotting and offering olive twigs, which may yet turn into olive branches. Number 3, avoid the demagogues. Demagogues are the ones who insist that talking with the other side is traitorous. It's creeping compromise. It's a first step into error. Let's say it clearly. These are misinformed and maladapted men and women who haven't been reading their Bibles much. Scripture calls us repeatedly to demonstrate the same deep respect for those who oppose our ideas as we usually reserve for those who are our greatest cheerleaders. Ellen White similarly reminds us of the unmatched example of Jesus. I love her words. Jesus did not suppress one word of truth, but he uttered it always in love. He exercised the greatest tact and thoughtful, kind attention in his relationships with the people. He was never rude, never needlessly spoke a severe word, never gave needless pain to a sensitive soul. He did not censure human weakness. He spoke the truth, but always in love. Those who can both imagine bridges and help to build bridges should expect that their motives will frequently be misunderstood by partisans on both sides of the chasm. Their loyalties and their motives will be the source of endless gossip between those who refuse to hear the gospel's clarion call to peace within the household of faith. Talking with the enemy, that is not, as some would claim, a sign of unfaith. It is a sign of genuine, real faith. Only confident faith, which rests on the merits of Jesus and not on the cleverness of logic. Only confident faith is competent to negotiate with those who have opposing views. And negotiate we must. When we actually listen to what the other is saying. When they are no longer ducking our rhetorical Molotov cocktails, then we can begin to see what is really at issue and maybe imagine how it can be resolved. Those who build bridges from fragile kite strings should expect to get walked upon. I testify. Those who build bridges should expect to get walked upon. The test of a bridge is ultimately whether it can bear traffic and become the path of communication and connectedness. Number 4, stay at the task of peace. We frequently remind each other that Rome wasn't built in a day, but then again, neither was Jerusalem. And if Jesus has gone to prepare a place for us, he has chosen to make his New Jerusalem a hallmark of his craftsmanship, even as his Spirit shapes the men and women who will ultimately be allowed to live in it. The fact that there are multiple references in the book of Acts and in the epistles of Peter and John and Paul to persistent conflict in the church tells us something vital. And here it is. The task of reconciliation is as essential to the Church of Jesus Christ as are the tasks of proclamation, evangelism, pastoral care, and compassion. I'm going to say that one more time. The task of reconciliation is as essential to the Church of Jesus Christ as are the tasks of proclamation, evangelism, pastoral care, and compassion. Reconciliation in the church deserves the full attention of those who lead and serve and disagree. That's exactly why Paul called it the ministry of reconciliation, because it should be an essential and structured part of our life together. We ought to learn how to talk with each other. As long as there are humans in God's church, reconciliation is going to be necessary. You know this, even the closest friends will frequently have to choose to be reconciled to each other instead of letting a minor difference blossom into a new war. And this doesn't happen because we occasionally mumble the prayer of St. Francis. Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace. Or we pull out our Beatles album and play Give Peace a Chance. There are going to be hours, there are going to be days, there are going to be weeks, months, maybe years of hard, sometimes thankless effort, for those who understand that unity is forged in fire. Think about it. Like every other welding job, the welding of believers' lives together is going to have both some heat and some friction if it's going to last. We're going to prize our unity only when we see what we have given and given up to achieve it. Well, the secret of sharing a great story is knowing when to end. I think the time has come. I have been watching your faces. I can see that you are already writing other endings to this story, and that's exactly as it should be. And so, with the snow and the wind driving off the lake today, it makes it an excellent day to go fly a kite.
Thank you, Brother Bill. And I don't think we've ever had anything to be reconciled about. We've looked at August 1492 and the amazing coincidence of the final expulsion of the Jews from Spain. The amazing coincidence of their expulsion from Spain on the very same day that Columbus launched the expedition that discovered a new world that would become the bastion of religious toleration. Jump ahead exactly 80 years to August 1572, Paris. Roiled in religious tension between the Catholic masses and the court on one side and the strong and influential Protestant Huguenot minority on the other. There were apparently some attempts by the king, Charles IX, and his mother, Catherine de' Medici, to bring some peaceful, tenuous resolution. But on August 22, there was an attempted assassination of a key Huguenot leader, and the king and his mother feared a huge Protestant reprisal, and so they simply took the initiative and suddenly ordered the killing of all the major Protestant leaders in the city. And it started just after midnight on August 24. With a list of key figures to be dragged from their beds and murdered. But as the general Catholic population learned what was taking place, the mayhem suddenly exploded far beyond what the king and his mother may have initially intended. Adventists who read the book Great Controversy are familiar with the summary details of that terrible event because it is described in terrible language there. After recounting some of the scenes of the religious persecution in France that prepared the way for the French Revolution, Ellen White says this, quote, "But the blackest in the black catalog of crime, most horrible among the fiendish deeds of all of the dreadful centuries, was the St. Bartholomew Day massacre. The world still recalls with shuddering horror the scenes of that most cowardly and cruel onslaught." Beginning on August 24, the massacre roared out of Paris and spread to 12 major cities around France and lasted for several weeks. How many Protestants died? The numbers vary widely, from the low few thousands to perhaps 30,000 to 70,000. The world still recalls with shuddering horror the scenes of that most cowardly and cruel onslaught, so she said. And of course, we know how the news of the massacre was celebrated with great delight in Rome. St. Bartholomew's Day. It may not have been intentional to occur on that day, but it is interesting to note that the day was the day in the church calendar to honor Jesus' disciple by that name, who some think was also Nathaniel, and church tradition had long held that Bartholomew had been a missionary to India, Persia, Armenia, that he died a martyr's death by being skinned alive and then beheaded, And the observance of his memory on August 24 is to honor, among other things, his dedication and courage in the face of persecution. Now, jump ahead exactly 90 years to England in August 1662. Puritans have been trying to reform the Church of England for 100 years. Queen Elizabeth kept them somewhat in check. James I muddled through, and Charles I angered them to the point that they felt justified in executing him. And Cromwell ruled England without a king for several years. By 1660, the national mood turned back toward having a king. The Puritans were fearful that Charles II, still in exile, would undo many of the reforms that they had brought about in the Church of England if he were to be returned. But in the negotiation for his return, he made warm promises that he would not force ministers of the Church into any strict conformity to high church Anglicanism. So the Puritans went along with the national mood and supported his return. And within 18 months, they realized that they had been outmaneuvered. They had lost their majority influence in Parliament, and by May of 1662, Parliament, with pressure from the high church bishops, had passed the Act of Uniformity. Now remember that all pastors and ministers were paid by the state. If you were a parish pastor anywhere in England, your entire living was dependent on the taxes that were collected for your parish by the state. And Parliament, with counsel from the bishops of the church, had the power, Parliament had the power to determine the details of how you conducted your church, right down to the smallest details of what you wore and words you recited in public prayers. Parliament had the authority to do that. The Act of Uniformity was a draconian swing back toward high church Anglicanism. Its official long title was An Act for the Uniformity of Public Prayers and Administration of Sacraments and Other Rites and Ceremonies, and for establishing the form of making and ordaining and consecrating bishops, priests, and deacons in the Church of England. Reform-minded pastors of all kinds, Presbyterian, Baptist, Calvinists, all then earning their livings as ministers of the Church of England, were horrified. Among other things, large and small, the act required that they be reordained by the High Church Anglican Episcopacy, something they found wholly repugnant. They'd be required to use the sign of the cross at baptism. It's an example of the detail. And rigid conformity to the often theologically objectionable Book of Common Prayer. They had to submit to all of the details of the act, or they would lose their jobs and be turned out of their churches. The act was passed on May 19, and the date to submit to the act, that is, swear the oath or be turned out, was fixed for their decision on Sunday, August 24. Submit, sign the oath, and keep your job. Refuse and lose everything. August 24. And to add to the outrage, it was sort of an open secret that that date was knowingly chosen by a supposedly Protestant church and parliament in full awareness of what had occurred 90 years before on that very day in Paris. 2,000 ministers, 2,000 ministers, nearly 20% of the total pastorate of the Church of England, said, we can't do this. And so they were shut out from everything, their livings, their parishioners, public service jobs of any kind, attendance at university, even the vote. But as Presbyterians and Baptists and Calvinists and later Methodists who were subject to the same rules, they kept evangelical Protestantism alive in England. One of the worst days in the history of Protestantism. Protestants persecuted by Protestants, and yet considered another way one of the very best. And here's how J.A. Wiley, in his monumental History of Protestantism, records it. Listen to what he said. Issues of tremendous magnitude hung on the part which the Puritan ministers acted on that day, August 24. If they should succumb, farewell to the Reformation in England. But their sacrifice saved the realm of England by preserving the Protestant element in the nation, which, had the Puritans conformed, would have utterly perished. St. Bartholomew's Day, he continues, is one of the great outstanding epochs in the long combat of conscience against power. It teaches us that victories of conscience must always bear outwardly the guise of defeat. I repeat that. Victories of conscience must always bear outwardly the guise of defeat. And the failures of power must come in the garb of victory. And thus it is, through seeming triumph, that error marches to ruin, and through apparent defeat, the truth advances to dominion. August 24, 1572, 1662, days an earlier Roosevelt might have said that will live in infamy. But there is another August 24. There is another August 24, a bit better, actually, known to us. In fact, we celebrated it in a big way here at Pioneer this past August 24, when we marked the exact 150th anniversary of the first day of classes on August 24, 1874, at Battle Creek College, an institution that has continued down to this day and even into this very church building this Sabbath afternoon, as we give great heed and credence and memory to the great principle of religious liberty.
Would you all stand, please? I see that potluck look in your face, all right? Shake the hand of the person next to you, greet them, glad that they're here, yes? Say hello, very good, yes? All right, don't start a conversation, sit down, okay? Those of you at home, we know if you stood or not, we're watching. Let me read to you something that, if you have spent any time in the Adventist church, you are familiar with. I want to read to you from Revelation chapter 13, beginning with verse 11. In my Bible, this is what it says. Then I saw another beast coming out of the earth. He had two horns like a lamb, but he spoke like a dragon. He exercised all the authority of the first beast on his behalf and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose fatal wound had been healed. And he performed great and miraculous signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to earth in full view of men. Because of the signs he was given power to do on behalf of the first beast, he deceived the inhabitants of the earth. He ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. He was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast so that it could speak, and caused all who refused to worship the image to be killed. He also forced everyone, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on his right hand or on his forehead, so that no one could buy or sell unless he had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of his name. Now, this is not a prophecy seminar. We are talking about religious liberty. So I am going to cut corners wildly and tell you an interpretation of these events that is perhaps common knowledge to Adventists and Protestant reformers for 500 plus years. If it's new to you and you have questions, come and see me afterwards. At the end of time, Revelation 13 falls into this series of events at the very end of time. We stand on the cusp of it. We are not there yet. An unholy trinity, this combination of three entities, rises up to help usher in the final events. The first one is the dragon, which is identified as Satan himself explicitly in Revelation chapter 12. The second is called the beast out of the sea, and it rises up at the beginning of chapter 13. It is identified as the papacy, the Roman Church. The third member of the unholy trinity, a counterfeit of the Holy Spirit, is the United States. And it rises up here out of the land. This is sometimes called the land beast that rises up here. It is the United States of America, and it's described as being lamb-like. Ellen White, one of the founders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church and a true prophet of God, had this to say about it. Let me put this on the screen here for you. Signs of the Times, November 1, 1899. This power, referring to Revelation 13:11, the last that is to wage war against the church and the law of God, was symbolized by a beast with lamb-like horns. The two horns, like a lamb, well represent the character of the United States government as expressed in its two fundamental principles, republicanism and Protestantism. These principles are the secret of our power and prosperity as a nation. Those who first found an asylum on the shores of America rejoiced that they had reached a country free from the arrogant claims of popery and the tyranny of kingly rule. They determined to establish a government upon the broad foundations of civil and religious liberty, she continues. But the stern tracing of the prophetic pencil reveals a change in this peaceful scene. The beast with lamb-like horns speaks with the voice of a dragon and exerciseth all the power of the first beast before him. Prophecy declares that he will say to them that dwell on the earth that they should make an image to the beast, and that he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, and that no man might buy or sell, save that he had the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. Thus, she concludes, Protestantism follows in the steps of the papacy. Now, this is at the top of the list of the reasons why Seventh-day Adventists, perhaps more than any other single group of people today, ought to know how precious freedom and liberty are. Because God has entrusted with us insights into the prophetic timeline, the understanding that is rarely found in other places, and among these prophecies that we understand so well is what the United States will become. The country that certainly I love and have been blessed by, my guess is you have been blessed by it as well, will not remain a place of blessing. And because we know this in advance, the members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, we have dedicated untold millions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of work hours, and more than 100 years to the formal defense of religious liberty. Because when religious liberty goes away, this we know well, it's only a matter of time before every other liberty goes away as well. So how to preserve it? Well, a complete treatment of how liberty is to be defended is too broad of a topic for my few minutes with you this afternoon. But I will focus on at least two historically fruitful paths to preserving liberty, and they are both reflected in Ellen White's previous statement in Signs of the Times. Let me put that back up on the screen here for you. Again, Signs of the Times, November 1, 1899. She says, the two horns like a lamb well represent the character of the United States government as expressed in its two fundamental principles, republicanism and Protestantism. These principles are the secret of our power and prosperity as a nation. Now, that's a fascinating statement. Many Christians today would say that, well, God is the secret of our success. And there's no doubt that God has blessed the United States immensely. Ellen White actually explicitly says that in other places. But that's not what she chooses to put here. We might be tempted to place, national defense. We've always had strong military. This is why we're so successful. The prophet says here, republicanism and Protestantism. And just in case we fail to understand the importance that she assigns to these two principles, notice what she says here, Testimonies, Volume 5, page 451. When our country, looking to the end of time, Revelation 13 territory, when our country shall repudiate every principle of its constitution as, here those two things are again, a Protestant and Republican government, then we may know that the time has come for the marvelous working of Satan and that the end is near. And thus clearly, Protestantism and republicanism are crucial to the preservation of our nation, in large part because they are crucial to preserving religious and civil liberty. So I want to take a few moments here and unpack both of these things. Let's begin with Protestantism. Now, Protestantism, I'm guessing, is something that at least probably most of you have some passing, at least, familiarity with. So I'm only going to spend a moment on Protestantism. Theologically speaking, Protestantism has been characterized as a belief in salvation by grace alone, salvation through faith in Jesus Christ alone, with the Bible as the sole ultimate authority, sometimes referred to as the three what? Anybody remember? Yes, the three solas, of which the Protestant Reformation, that was what it was primarily fought over, were the three solas. But we are speaking politically here. Protestantism as a political concept. Politically speaking, Protestantism is not, I repeat, not strictly speaking synonymous with Christianity, nor any one denomination within Christianity. Rather, at its core, in the United States, Protestantism is the belief in the paramount value of the individual's right to be free from religious coercion. Protestantism deeply holds to the right of the individual to worship or not to worship according to the dictates of his or her own conscience. And to that end, Protestantism in America upholds a sacred distinction between religion and governance. Thomas Jefferson, you may recall, 1802, he wrote that famous letter talking about a wall of separation between what? Church and state, exactly. Protestantism thus refuses to consolidate religious authority in an individual or small group of individuals that has governing authority, because that too easily leads to religious coercion. Politically speaking, that's Protestantism. Now, this is, of course, one of the defining distinctions between Protestantism and Catholicism. Now, I want to pause for just a moment and be very clear about something. Catholicism and the observance of Catholicism in the global West has dramatically liberalized over the last 50 years. I don't know if anybody that is aware of these types of trends that will dispute that. And Catholics are often very pleased in the West about this. The number of Catholics that attend Mass, and certainly the number of Catholics, for instance, that attend confessional with a priest, is dramatically down from what it used to be. Catholics often freely use methods of contraception that would previously have been verboten, still are, but they choose to use it. And the idea of there being a supreme religious figure at the papacy that is then able to control the religious expression and belief of the masses around the world. In the global West, that has dramatically diminished, and thus sources of friction between Protestants in the West and Catholics in the West has greatly diminished. But Catholic scholars and myself disagree heartily with many Adventists currently who are saying that Catholicism itself at root has changed, particularly post-Vatican II in the 1960s. They disagree with you, Catholic scholars do, because the papacy never intended for its core principles to be altered, not just by Vatican II, but by any of the ecumenical councils that have taken place. It is substantially the same at its core as it was prior to Vatican II. Rome has not changed, but it's possible that we have. And thus, I still contend that Protestantism remains an extremely important part of preserving religious liberty. And Christians, therefore, have an ongoing duty to use their vote and influence to preserve the Protestant underpinnings of the United States government, not to the point of favoring one specific religion over another or religion over irreligion, but rather for the preservation of the Protestant principle of preserving freedom of conscience, the separation of church and state, and refusing to embrace religious tyranny. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that is not always easy. That can be a tall order to fill. In fact, sometimes it seems impossibly hard. But we must pursue it as long as we are able. That's Protestantism. What about republicanism? I hope by now you understand. We're not talking about the Republican Party versus the Democratic Party. No, this is lowercase r, even though Ellen White in some of her quotes puts it in an uppercase. What is this kind of republicanism? Well, republicanism as a principle, a philosophy of government, has been expressed differently, literally for centuries. As early as the 4th century BC, the Greeks were postulating about republican forms of government, Aristotle and Plato, etc. And right up to the present, many different countries countries have practiced republican forms of government. So what's our particular flavor in the United States? Well, United States republicanism is built upon several things: the respect for individual rights and freedoms, the rejection of a nobility or a monarchical class, a king in other words, and the seminal idea that power flows from the citizenry up rather than from the government down. This is because in the United States, our form of republicanism, the government does not grant rights to the people. It instead recognizes the rights in the people that God has already given to them. The people, through a duly constituted elective process, are ultimately therefore sovereign, not the government. And while there is clearly much more detail that we could go into about republicanism, I hope by now it is easy to see how Republican principles, when combined with Protestant principles, have proven to be excellent ways to preserve both civil and religious liberty. The Founding Fathers and millions of other people since have found them to be truly outstanding principles to live by, which naturally brings up an important question. How were Protestantism and republicanism to be protected? I mean, the Founding Fathers didn't just want these things to just kind of, magically somehow be sustained, because they knew that they would not be, human nature being what it is. And so they put in place a couple of things to preserve these things. It was based under a basic banner that I would describe as the appropriate diffusion of power. Let that sink in. The appropriate diffusion of power. And this was expressed in at least two indispensable ways: federalism and the separation of powers. Let me define these briefly for you. Federalism is the idea of the diffusion of authority among the states and the federal government. In fact, the very term federal government comes from the fact that the people in the states, the federation of the states, have allocated some duties and authorities to the central governance body. These powers of the federal government are enumerated. In other words, the federal government's authority is not to do whatever it wants to do, or to do whatever the individual states don't want to do. The federal government's authority is instead to be clearly defined and limited by what the residents of the states have voted that authority to be, and no further. These are the enumerated powers as defined in the United States Constitution. And what about the separation of powers? Well, separation of powers is a philosophy of diffusing authority, but as practiced in the United States, it's probably most famously known through the three branches of government: the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branches of government. The idea is that power is not consolidated in one place or the other. It is instead diffused. There are checks and balances that keep tyranny from rising and keep liberty preserved. And notice carefully, Revelation chapter 13, while it does not specifically name the breaking down of federalism or the separation of powers as steps leading to those final tragic events, logic nonetheless demands that Revelation 13's brand of tyranny has a smaller chance of developing in a republic that is based on healthy federalism and separation of powers. Does that make sense? Okay, I see a lot of nodding heads. Preservation of tyranny. This is precisely why the founders did what they did. This is why they pursued federalism and the separation of powers. Now, I know that all of you have read all of the Federalist Papers, and I'm just about to repeat to you what you already know, okay? If you don't know what the Federalist Papers are, they're not legal documents, but they are fascinating because they are from three of the founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison. And essentially, it's a series of letters back and forth, where they were discussing what does it mean to set up a government of the people, by the people, for the people. How does that work and last? Well, James Madison, Federalist number 48, he had this to say. He said, the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one or a few or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. In other words, this was front and center in the Founding Fathers' thinking. Most people don't know how much the Founding Fathers studied. They knew the task before them. They had seen things go south before. They knew clearly the results of forms of government that consolidate power in one man or in one group of men, and they had no interest in the oppression that inevitably followed. This is why, to come back to the present, every Christian ought to use their voice and their vote to protect the key practices of federalism and the separation of powers. Now, this may seem kind of abstract and abstruse, kind of this arcane knowledge. Well, why do we have to be aware of these things? There are very real-world consequences if you ignore these two things. And the reason for that is because their underpinnings come from God Himself. Now, the United States was not founded as a Christian nation, contrary to what some people are saying. In fact, it was explicitly not founded as a Christian or any other particular religion type of nation. The Founding Fathers were generally deists. They were not evangelical Christians. But they put in place something that was, in many cases, a reflection of God and His nature. God Himself shares power with others. He diffuses His power to other people, as reckless as we humans may sometimes think that would be. And consequently, it stands to reason that all healthy human governments ought to do the same. Now, we see this in Scripture in a number of places. The Trinity. It's one God, but with three persons in this one God. That's, of course, a divine mystery. But it clearly shows that even within Himself, God is sharing authority and power. Jesus talked about this many times in His earthly ministry. God loves to share appropriately authority with others. Adam and Eve, when the world is created, what does He say to them? He said, the world is yours. Rule over it and subdue it. God made it. It was His. And yet He freely diffuses His authority to Adam and Eve to rule over it. Even in the Christian church, when God sets up in the New Testament His Christian church, He diffuses intentionally through it the authority that He grants. He has offices established. There are deacons and deaconesses and elders there, and the apostles have a kind of a more regional authority. Authority is intentionally done where the people elect their leaders and power is shared. It is the way of God. God created life such that society works best when decision-making authority is diffused through a plurality of the people. And consequently, Bible-believing Christians should always be on their guard when one man or one woman or a small group in government gains too much power or is poised to gain too much power. Three things quickly in relation to this point. First, in light of what we have just covered, we are reminded that the United States is not a pure democracy. You know what the old saying about pure democracies, right? Democracy is three wolves and a sheep deciding what's for supper. Okay, and the Founding Fathers were not in favor of a pure democracy because they knew that it would lead to oppressed minorities that would not have a voice. And that's why we are a constitutional republic. We, the people, vote and elect representatives who then represent our interest in legislative assemblies, et cetera, et cetera. Secondly, the fact that we are a republic means that our government is therefore, wait for it, designed to be slow. You ever thought about that? Designed to be slow. And as frustrating as that can be, the next time you're ready to curse Congress for gridlock, perhaps take a step back and instead rejoice. That very gridlock may well be federalism and the separation of powers at work, bringing in a multitude of counselors, preventing the country from making knee-jerk reactions that could strip individual liberties instead of protecting them. The Founding Fathers, in other words, made it so that the wheels of progress would turn slowly. Did you know that dictatorships are very efficient? They can get a lot done fast, right? Dictator comes to power, all the military, legislators, all under him, right? Fast things can happen. A lot of people can die quickly, too. They're very efficient at that as well. Founding Fathers knew it, so they said, tell you what, let's slow things down. No president is going to be able to just mash things through. Congress has to have checks and balances, representatives, all of these things. It's designed to work slowly. Be careful before you curse gridlock. And third, let me quickly give you an example of something that can be a threat to federalism and the separation of powers. And that is executive orders. Now, executive orders in and of themselves are a good thing. They have been around since the very beginning. George Washington was the very first president to issue an executive order. Executive orders are implied in Article 2 of the Constitution. It's not explicit, but it's pretty clearly implied. It is essentially directives that are issued by the U.S. president for the purpose of advancing the just duties of his office. That's a good thing. In fact, I know at least one, I'm guessing most of you know at least one very, very good executive order, and that was the Emancipation Proclamation, 1862, Abraham Lincoln. That was an executive order. And we could go on. There's many, many good things that have come from executive orders. But this nonetheless proves a point. Executive orders are issued by one branch of the government, and they can affect a lot of people, so they deserve our scrutiny. Let me give you a very specific example. Some of you may remember we had a pandemic a few years ago. Anybody recall that? I'm not going to rehash what you probably are wondering if I'm going to rehash at this moment. I am instead going to point out the following. There were, as I think most of you know, in 2022, there were two mandates that were proposed through executive order. The Biden administration put out an OSHA ETS mandate, and there was a CMS mandate. The OSHA ETS mandate, this was for workers. It would have affected potentially about 84 million people in the country. If a person was not vaccinated at a certain time and date, then fines could be levied against the employer, potentially shutting the company down. That was the OSHA ETS. The CMS was for medical workers. It would have affected potentially about 10 million medical workers in the United States. That's a lot of people. That's approaching, that's more than a quarter of the population. Ultimately, the Supreme Court made two decisions. You may recall when that happened. For 3.5 or 4 days, both of those mandates were essentially the law of the land. But the Supreme Court met, and they struck down the OSHA ETS, and they sustained the CMS, the one for medical workers. In the midst of that controversy, most people, understandably, were caught up in is the vaccine a good thing or a bad thing, the physical implications, mortality, etc. What got lost often, although not on the Supreme Court, was the fact of how much the ideas of federalism and the separation of powers played into what the Supreme Court said. The OSHA ETS was struck down not because of any commentary on the efficacy of the vaccine or not, but because essentially the Biden administration, the executive branch, had overstepped its bounds. The separation of powers was not being sufficiently honored according to the Constitution in the eyes of the Supreme Court. OSHA, a congressionally mandated body, did not have within its scope of power, its charter from Congress, the ability to implement a vaccine mandate on that magnitude. The Biden administration, as an executive branch, was seeking to order them to do so. Congress said, no, that's not your place, that's not your authority. Plus, there was a precedent. Up to that time, nearly all vaccine mandates had only been done at the state level, not the federal level. And thus, federalism and the separation of powers were pivotal principles in that Supreme Court decision. The CMS, the one for medical people mandate, that was upheld on the same grounds. Because unlike OSHA, the administration of Medicare and Medicaid funds were administered by the federal government. And the executive branch did have authority, the Supreme Court ruled, in its scope, to be able to put stipulations on the reception of Medicare and Medicaid funds. If you're a hospital, they said, the federal government can make reasonable, and this is what they said was reasonable, demands for medical workers to have vaccination or not be allowed to work. So the CMS stood. And again, behind all of those things was federalism and the separation of powers. Make no mistake, ladies and gentlemen, every executive order that you see come on the news, you should read about. You should check it out. It might be great. It might be awful. All executive orders are subject to judicial review, but sometimes that judicial ball doesn't get rolling until people start to call their representatives and say, would you please do something about this? It's just one example. But it shows very clearly the effect that these things can have. And coming back now to the big picture here, why do I bring these things up? This, federalism, separation of powers, Precisely because of this. In my experience, too often, Christians, including Seventh-day Adventists, who have had exposure to things like Revelation 13, etc., too often, they vote and vocalize support in politics by focusing on a single issue. Immigration. abortion, taxes, national defense, et cetera, to the exclusion of bigger and often even more impactful considerations. Now, don't misunderstand. Abortion and national defense, those are all important issues, and it would be even better if Christians stepped back, took a broader biblical perspective, looked at broader biblical principles, and asked a question like this. And to me, this is so important. I'm going to put it word for word here on the screen for you. Will the support I'm about to give or withdraw from this specific issue tend towards the consolidation of power in the hands of the few, or towards the appropriate diffusion of power in the hands of the many? Ladies and gentlemen, make no mistake, Antichrist will thrive on tyranny when fully formed. Republican forms of government, on the other hand, such as the one intended to be used in this country, can do an excellent job of keeping tyranny out. It is therefore entirely possible that the longer we can keep power dispersed in the hands of the many rather than the hands of the few, the longer this nation and the world will refuse to welcome Antichrist or his spirit. So let us recognize afresh the value of federalism and the separation of powers, and may we as Christians use our voices and our votes accordingly. Which brings us to some Q&A. Bill, let's see. I don't think we have assigned tables. You come on up. Yes, feel free. Yes. Let's see. Looking for my spot here. While they are making their way up here, I can almost guarantee you that we will not have time for all the questions. There are hundreds of people that are not even in this room that are wanting to ask some questions, and the lines here are already reasonably full. There's not a live mic here, just to clarify, so if you have a question, we're not going to have raising his hand. You can text this in, and we will do our best to get to these as much as we can. I have had a chance to look at some of these just before I came up, and some of these questions are redundant. So in other words, there's a number of people that are asking. And so, Bill, I'm going to start with you. There are a number of questions here, and let me just use the verbiage here of one of them. Bill, you've chosen to reach out beyond the historic religious liberty allies in Washington, D.C. and engage with some organizations that are advocating for legislation or policy that you and most Adventists find problematic. Tell us about your experience this past year with Heritage Foundation and Project 2025. That'll satisfy about 25% at least of the questions that have been coming in. So go ahead.
One of the ideas that dominated my early engagement in the role that I'm now in, and that Jennifer previously had, was having looked at the way, broadly speaking, the church navigated with advocacy groups. I was concerned that we were not well known by many who are involved in helping to craft legislation, shaping public opinion by their documents, and that one of the best things I could do was to invest in being known and being available to answer questions. In that process, just about, I guess it would have been January of 24, we were on, as I remember it, a Union Parle Zoom conference. And just about that time, Project 2025 had become a discussion point in the media. It was beginning to emerge, a lot of conversation about it, and among Adventists, particularly the one page in that nearly 1,000-page document that dealt with Sabbath keeping. Well, obviously, Seventh-day Adventists care deeply about this issue, and we have decades of engagement, as Jennifer and others have detailed. And I remember sitting on the Parle discussion, and late in the conversation that day, there were several who began talking about Project 2025, the Sabbath keeping page there, and several individuals, not Jennifer, described their lack of full sympathy, I think I would call it, for the purposes of Heritage Foundation and what it was doing with Project 2025 as a template for what they hoped would be a new Republican administration. I decided not to raise my hand and tell them that I was taking the two chief litigators of Heritage Foundation to lunch the next day. I didn't think that was going to endear me to those in the conversation who would wonder, why in the world is he doing that? But the premise is still the same. It's about engagement. It is not about the attraction of these ideas in my soul. I want to know why they say what they do. I want to be understood. I want my church to be understood. And so at lunch the next day, I sat with the two litigators in a restaurant on Capitol Hill, and we talked about Project 2025. And I said, by the way, you should know that though it's a relatively small piece of the document, Seventh-day Adventists are very, very interested in one page in that document. And I described the consternation we had expressed in that Zoom call about the fact that this page was what we would call in composition a non sequitur. It had odd ideas wedged on the same page. The first major paragraph said, if you are an employer and you have a Sabbath keeper who wants time off, you should pay them time and a half if you require them to work. I understood quickly that whoever wrote that paragraph had never actually talked with the Sabbath keeper, probably. But the succeeding paragraph, the only other paragraph on the page, actually said, now in the Judeo-Christian heritage, Sabbath keeping is an honored principle, and we need to think about this. It was a respectful but sort of non-committal paragraph. The oddity was the sequencing on the one page of two ideas that made no sense together. The old editor in me was leaping into action. Well, I asked them about this page, and they said, well, we don't know, but we'll refer you to the people who manage the project. I said, would you, please? And true to their word, the next day there were letters of introduction copying me to the project manager for Project 2025, and in early February last year, I found myself on a Zoom call with Paul Dans, the manager of Project 2025. He apologized for getting on the Zoom call a little late. He said he was at a rally for Donald Trump in South Carolina at the time, and he had been held up by a few minutes, but he was glad to talk with me. So I asked him, I said, no, my concerns are fairly narrow, but they are important to Seventh-day Adventists. I want to know about how you arrived at this very unique page that deals with Sabbath keeping. And he started laughing. And I didn't think I had said anything funny. And he said, you found it. And I said, yeah, found what? He said, quite frankly, several times in the construction of this big document, we came up on issues on which we could come to no conclusion. There are those of us in the Heritage Foundation who are economic conservatives, and we just simply don't understand the realm of faith. We don't even try. And then there are people of deep religious faith in the Heritage Foundation, and, well, we're responsible for one paragraph, and they're responsible for the other, and we couldn't come to any agreement, and we just wedged these things on the same page and turned the page. Well, that didn't give me a very satisfying answer, but it did explain how we arrived at this document that had been puzzling so many of us. I use that story only as an illustration of one point, not my attraction to the ideas they are driving forward in that document, but the importance of the work that Jennifer did, that I'm doing now, which is engagement with public officials, even those with whom we have fundamental disagreements, to find out what is motivating the legislation they're proposing or the actions they're proposing, and do they understand the legitimate and reasonable and constitutional principles that Seventh-day Adventists are articulating in this situation. At the time, I had an intern working with me, and one day we were walking down Capitol Hill back to Union Station after a luncheon with representatives of another conservative advocacy group. And my intern turned to me and he said, now, Bill, if you had to summarize in one sentence what you're trying to do here, what would you say? It was a good question. I'm not sure my answer will live through the ages. But I said, well, here it is. When they are working on a piece of legislation, when advocacy groups are moving a project forward that they hope to turn into legislation, and it crosses their mind that Seventh-day Adventists might care about that thing they are crafting, I want to be the person they call right then. I want to be on their speed dial. I want to have a chance to talk about something preemptively and not just reactively when it becomes legislation and we have difficulties and members struggle. That principle of engagement doesn't require me to like the ideas of those advocating it, But as Jennifer knows and did, and as I am doing, and as others in Parle directors and the NAD Parle office are doing, we're out there trying to engage with those who we may disagree with, but nonetheless who need to understand Seventh-day Adventists and our legitimate concerns.
29-second follow-up for you.
Okay.
People are asking, how likely do you think it is that the 2025 will be enacted into legislation?
I believe there are a few ideas in Project 2025 that have probably already become favorites of some persons in the new administration. Broadly speaking, it would be, I believe, difficult for a large-scale enactment of Project 2025. Documents like this have been created by think tanks for every administration, liberal and conservative, for the last 50 years. The think tanks in Washington, D.C. thrive on their ability to influence incoming administrations. Project 2025 happened to be one of the better known ones, but it's not for the lack of progressive ones or other conservative versions. In fact, I just read the other day of a new 19-page agenda manifesto that actually has received very little attention in the press, but is actually having a bigger impact on what the Trump administration may choose to do.
Interesting. Jennifer, for you, and I'm going to summarize because this is another 25% of the questions coming in. Essentially, what's so bad about having Christian principles being taught in public schools? What's so wrong with having 10 Commandments being required to be in public spaces and part of a curriculum? Help us understand more about that.
Sure. I think that if we're talking about a comparative religion class, then discussing the 10 Commandments, discussing the Bible makes perfect sense, right? But we're in a pluralistic society, and to single out the 10 Commandments or to single out biblical infused curriculum into a public school setting is the state endorsing a particular religion, specifically Christianity. When I think as Pastor Shane talked about, it goes down a whole rabbit hole once we start endorsing religion from the state. It flies against the principles of Protestantism and federalism, right? And I think that, you might be like, oh, well, the 10 Commandments, they are undergirded, within our moral laws and they are the basis of so much. Well, that might be some people's perspective, but when we're singling out one document and not including all the other documents that also are foundations of our laws and the government, I think that it's kind of clear that we're favoring one religion over many others.
Thank you. A question that has come up a number of times here in the thread, and again, I will summarize here. Because we know what Bible prophecy says, that there will be religious persecution, that the mark of the beast, that whole scenario is coming, why not speed things up? Or why not at least just get out of the way so that it can happen and we can go home, we can be in heaven? Why put so much into protecting religious liberty? Either one of you, take a chance.
Well, I'll start by saying that, there's still so much of the world that we haven't reached yet, right? And so anything that says, let's speed this up, it's kind of selfish, right? It's saying, well, forget about the other people that have not had a chance to know Christ or to accept him. And I think as Adventists, we want to still reach the world, right? And so I'm looking forward to Christ's coming, but I'm not trying to advance it at the peril of people not getting to have the chance to accept or reject the gift that he's offering them.
I would add that chaos, and that's what we're describing, a movement toward chaos, is rarely a time when people do their best thinking. And as a consequence, we may feel protected in our faith in Jesus and that whatever happens to us, we know our destiny. But millions, billions of people around the world are not there yet. And if we accelerate the end times, as we might hope, some people might hope, by our actions or lack of actions, we are actually dooming many people to chaos, consternation, and loss. It is not compassionate to wish a rapid end to the world that leaves people in chaos.
So potentially, if I'm understanding you correctly, what you're saying is that you might actually be furthering the devil's agenda by refusing to engage in religious liberty and its defense and whatnot. So, okay, all right. Now, there was a number of more finely tuned questions about Jennifer, your comments about the promotion of religion formally in public schools. There's a number of fine-tuned ones about 2025, and I don't think I'm going to be able to get to anywhere near all of them, so I'm just going to randomly pick here, all right? Curious about the comment about having chaplains in public schools as though that was a bad thing. Why is that suspect? A non-Christian counselor also has influence on young minds. We have chaplains in the military. So again, kind of a finer point on this.
Well, one of the issues is that these chaplains aren't actually trained counselors, they're just trained chaplains. And chaplaincy and school counseling, those are two different areas of expertise, right? So I think there's nothing wrong if you have a trained school counselor who also happens to be a chaplain, but just saying, hey, you're a chaplain, you can now here counsel these kids on a whole host of issues. It's kind of disrespectful for those who actually are engaged in school counseling and have trained in the area of school counseling.
Okay, very good. Bill, for you, and I'm not quite sure how to summarize this. It's quite a lengthy question here. Tell you what, I'm going to open this up for both of you, just your perceptions. Given the plethora, at least in the person who's asking this question, of executive orders over the last few administrations, which, by the way, FDR by far takes the cake. Okay, it was over 3,000 that he did. So there's no danger of our current presidents reaching that goal, at least at this point. Do you feel that there is a danger of the executive branch becoming more powerful than the other two branches of government? Is that a legitimate fear, or is that just smoke?
Historians have observed the growth of the executive power in the United States vis-a-vis the other centers of authority in the last 50 to 60 years. There's been undoubtedly a trending that way. Some of that is a reflection of the way our media culture focuses on personality more than on process. Actually, I find myself often thinking, however, when I hear about an executive order, okay, that's going to last for 2 months, 6 months, 8 months until it is in judicial review, and there undoubtedly will be not only actions taken that would restrain it, but very likely in many cases to be overturned. I would even point you to an example with FDR. FDR's executive order, a day that will live in infamy, to bring Japanese Americans, U.S. citizens, away from coastal Pacific and put them in camps. Let's call them concentration camps. Right. That was an executive order which he knew at the point he issued it would ultimately be overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court, which it was after it wound its way through the courts, but by then the war was nearly over and the perceived threat was gone. Fascinatingly, the governor who helped facilitate that executive order, a Republican by the name of Earl Warren, went on to be the progressive Supreme Court Chief Justice, and he facilitated that incarceration of Japanese American U.S. citizens. I've written and worked on that topic a lot, and it illustrates that the challenges do not come so much ideologically, but when an entity gets afraid, when fear begins to dominate the executive or Congress or the court, we usually see things that are not good for the nation and fortunately, many that get corrected in the process.
Thank you. I'm going to switch gears just a little bit here. There are some questions that are focusing in on some recent things with Title VII and some changes or enhancements, whatever, with religious accommodation. Can you address that for us a little bit?
Sure. So there was a case, Groff v. DeJoy, that came out. I'm sure some of you have heard of this, right? It was with a postal worker wanting religious accommodation to not have to deliver mail or work on their Sabbath, which was Sunday. And the Supreme Court, in part of that decision, they instituted a new standard for religious accommodation requests. Now, the old standard was that an employer had to accommodate a religious accommodation unless it would pose an undue burden. And undue burden was defined as anything more than de minimis. So, I mean, it could be a couple of dollars was an undue burden for an employer to accommodate an employee. Now, this new standard that came out from Groff is a substantial increase, right? A substantially increased cost to the employer. That's what now constitutes an undue burden. What we haven't yet seen is how the courts are really going to interpret this standard, right? It's definitely better than it was. We know that. It's a plus. It's a good thing. But the courts are still working through how they define as a significant increased cost to the employer.
I might add, and we were all monitoring that case literally from the office that Jennifer used to occupy across the street from the Supreme Court, in which I now work from, monitoring that case. And it was a rare moment of, I'll call it apparent unity. All 9 justices took the side of the plaintiff in this, with some distinctions among them. But it represented a reality check for many who have been highly fearful about what would be happening with the emergence of a more conservative court or whatever. These are individuals, for whatever we think of their views or their behaviors in certain things, who have been schooled in principles of American jurisprudence and law, and in many occasions they find their way through to the right result. I don't mean to suggest that there are not things to be concerned about, but usually not the hyperventilating language that we find on some of the really hot websites.
Okay. There's a number of questions here about Christian nationalism. Forgive me if I'm not picking your question. I'm picking at random here. The comments about Christian nationalism are sometimes puzzling. It seems to be used as a pejorative. It seems that Christians should, all caps, try to influence culture because we believe that the nation will be better with Christian values. For example, same-sex marriage. We disagree with this because history shows us that it leads to the breakdown of society. Why should we feel pressured to be silent when worldly people get to have a voice? What's the balance between being silent and speaking up? Either one of you.
Well, I'll start by saying that, yes, we should be influencing society, right? Part of that is through casting our ballot. Part of that is through advocacy work. But I think it's different between influencing society and telling society, you have to espouse to these same Christian values that I have, right? The Bible tells us not to kill. Is that a good value to try to have society adhere to? Definitely, right? Don't steal. That's a great value to try to have society adhere to. Honor the Lord your God. Don't take his name in vain. Is that something that I need to be coercing others in society to adhere to? Well, that's kind of between them and God, right? And some ways I see it broken down as between the 2 tablets, right? Between how how we treat our fellow man and our relationship to God. That's one way I've seen it broken down. But also I think that, we should have influence on society, but saying that you have to be Christian or you have to espouse by these Christian values in order to be a good citizen, I think that that's a line too far as I'm concerned.
This is not an altogether fair observation. I say that at the front. But Christian nationalism often fails in both halves of its name. It is neither fully Christian in its compassion for the weak, its care for the broken, its following the principles of Jesus in relationships between people, nor is it, in the finest sense, nationalism of the kind that recognizes the due powers distributed through the system of government. It is, in fact, a simplification, a generalization of ideas into a kind of flag waving for both a simplistic faith and a simplistic understanding of the nation. That's the fear. Informed people, both in their faith and their government, can more safely be trusted to make decisions.
We need to be drawing this to a close. I'm going to pick, this is our speed round. So I'm not saying they're speed round questions, but I'm going to ask you to be brief in your answers, okay? So my apologies for those of you whose questions we are not able to get. A very practical one. How do we broach the conversation with young people about religious liberty? How do we make this my sense is what they're saying is, how do we make this a continued part of the DNA of the Adventist Church with younger people? Either one.
Actually, at the moment, I happen to be working on a project to start developing a curriculum for children ages 6 to 12 that focuses specifically on the values of religious liberty. I'm working with several offshore media companies that have experience in designing materials that can be transnational, can work in many language environments. But the concern is absolutely right. The persons who care about religious liberty tend to be people our age or older, and we are not conveying the message, the principles to younger audiences. We have to do that by coming out and engaging on campuses and sitting down and talking about issues and letting people ask us the difficult questions, the uncomfortable questions. I firmly believe that that kind of engagement will bring a younger audience into defending these principles.
I also think that when we frame religious liberty as a fundamental human right,
Yes.
to show that when religious liberty is infringed upon, that other rights are also going to be infringed upon, that will also engage young people, and especially when we take it outside just the context of here in the United States, and
Yes.
we turn it more outward focused to show the majority of the world does not have the right to worship freely according to the dictates of their conscience, right? And you see all the things that take place. And I don't think it's just coincidental that some of these countries and some of these places where people's religious liberty rights are being infringed upon also have a host of other rights being infringed upon. If we get people engaged that way, I think that would encourage young people to take more attention, pay more attention to this.
Well said, well said. For both of you, I'll start with Bill. Two things. With regard to religious liberty in the current national context, what concerns you the most, and what are you most encouraged by?
What concerns me the most is the fact that many people are sitting back and waiting for something they consider bad to happen before they engage. And the point to engage is before the bad thing happens. For us to anticipate challenges, get into conversations. Frankly, my experience, and this is answering the other half of your question, my experience in dealing with these advocacy groups is that many of them simply don't understand our agenda. I am doing what I often call Adventism 101 in conversations. They're explaining the most basic things about our name and who we are over lunch. In fact, I have found a remarkable amount of goodwill, a remarkable amount of generosity and kindness, introductions to meet other people in the advocacy community. And that has been the good news there, that it is a kinder place than I knew. I wouldn't have known that from the media. Particularly Christian faith. There's a lot of Christians on Capitol Hill, and once they discover you're a believer, they really don't care what stripe you are. They will help open doors for you, give you access to people that you might not have met in other places, in other ways. I have found it a kinder and friendlier place than, frankly, I expected it to be.
I would say a concern that I have is that for some in society, they see religious liberty as the right for our rights, not anyone else's, right? They see it as self-centered just for Christianity, not really caring about other people. And I think that what gives me hope is that we're going to go out there and share, as Bill said, share our perspective, that we're not just concerned about our rights as Adventists to flourish. We're concerned about all individuals, even those of no faith tradition whatsoever. And I think that as we're out there mingling with society and letting them know who we are, then religious liberty rights will actually flourish in that kind of environment.
Yes, sir.
The case that she referred to, Groff v. DeJoy, the postal worker whose case was ultimately unanimously decided by the Supreme Court. When he began the process of litigation, he went to an Adventist attorney, the Parle director for the Pacific Union, and filed that case. They lost at that round, they lost at the appellate round, but ultimately that got picked up and other forces were brought to bear, and it succeeded. Adventists are known as the people who will help protect your liberty, even though in his case, the Sabbath he kept was Sunday.
Right, right.
Yep.
Two final things for you, very quick. First, more of an observation, looking for your confirmation or not. If someone has a religious liberty issue, is it as simple, can they pick up the phone and call your office? Is that a good place to start?
They should pick up the phone and call my office. And my number and my email address are publicly available, and I'm happy to share it with anyone.
And I agree, they should pick up the phone and call her office.
Right on. The website at which they would find your contact information is?
I believe it's lakeunionparle.org. I think that you can find the website right there directly to the Parle department.
I would add, we get a number of calls at the General Conference, but these are individuals who have not first gone through their conference or their union Parle, and we always refer people back to move through a process. Yeah. Handling issues as close to the area of origin as possible is always wise.
Right. And if someone does call my office, I will encourage them, have you talked to your pastor, right?
Yes.
And I'll engage the conference Parle director, but we'll figure it out. Even if you end up calling the GC, we'll figure it out. So
we end up making the connections
yeah, we'll
happen.
we know each other. So
Yeah.
but the important thing is to call, as soon as you know that there's an issue. I had someone call me the other day, and they'd already gone through the EEOC process. They'd already gone through all the courts, and they went through the appeal process. There's not much we can do to help you at that point. So call us sooner rather than later.
Well said.
And for those of you that are local in Michigan, the Michigan Conference Office also has a religious liberty representative. His name is Andy M. And if you go to the, misda.org, you will find his contact information there, or just see any of the pastoral staff here at Pioneer. We'd be happy to help. One last thing, not about specific individual cases, but if someone wants to keep up with the religious liberty advocacy work that the Seventh-day Adventist Church is doing, where do they go? What resources are out there for the average person to read and to keep up with what's going on?
Well, I'm going to give two resources. One is to go to religiousliberty.info. That is the North American Division of Religious Liberty page, and they will put news on there from time to time. And also, we are in the midst of the Liberty Campaign, and Liberty Magazine, it gives very up-to-date information on religious liberty issues, and the subscription's only $7. I mean, it's very informative. Most of the cases that I talked about were either referenced in Liberty Magazine, or they've done full articles on those cases. So if you want to stay up to date on what the current issues are, subscribe to Liberty Magazine, and also send a subscription to a friend.
And let me throw a bouquet to Liberty Magazine. I can say as an old editor, it is one of the best edited and best designed magazines the Seventh-day Adventist Church produces. And I say that in full knowledge of the years I spent in editorial work. It is quality, and it attracts the eyes of those who are in decision-making roles. I would also add AdventistLiberty.org, run by the General Conference Parole Department, and IRLA.org, which is International Religious Liberty Association, an umbrella organization supported by Seventh-day Adventists, the oldest such advocacy group in the world. That website is also updated with current information that particularly relates to the international religious scene, but also carries some things about the domestic situation.
Thank you very much for your input. Can we give some thanks to Jennifer and to Bill? Thank you very much for being here with us. This presentation will be archived on Pioneer's YouTube channel, as well as at eventually pmchurch.org. So you're welcome. If you have somebody that wanted to see this and wasn't able to make it, it will be available in that form. Ron, would you please come and close us out?
As some of you were coming in before the program, you heard Dr. Logan on the organ, reflecting and improvising on that great national hymn, America the Beautiful. And if you know the poem, you know that it is a very optimistic one, as well it should be, because this land, America, is optimistic. The last stanza carries that optimism beautifully, and I have loved it for years. It simply says, America, America, God mend thine every flaw. That's where the optimism is. Confirm thy soul in self-control, thy liberty in law. Thank you very much for joining us at Pioneer Memorial Church Religious Liberty Emphasis Day. And I expect that there will be more of these kinds of days in this church and in our fellowship around the world, more and more as we see the day approaching. Please stand for the benediction. The benediction is indeed the best of all words. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. Amen.